So the creation of software as portrayed in the popular media is often shown as a solo endeavor. This is a screen capture from the movie The Social Network that portrays the Facebook.com being created in kind of an evening of alcohol-induced coding. You can see, Mark Zuckerberg's beer right here. That's how it's often portrayed. Even going to look for photos around how people, portray programmers, you can see here, this is, a person by herself, programming. Oftentimes, programmers are portrayed in an environment with other people. You can see that there's another person here. But even in these circumstances, you can see that the programmer here actually has headphones on, isolating him or herself from the people and noise that is around them. And sometimes even these people are portrayed by themselves and with headphones. So, bringing these multiple things together, this is how oftentimes programming is portrayed. Sometimes it is how it is practiced. But in order to build products, we often need to collaborate. Now, collaboration in the computer realm is often not portrayed particularly well either in the media. I'm going to show a video clip, which I hope works well over Zoom and Whova, that doesn't necessarily portray programming, but does portray some people in a working together on a computer.
No way. I'm getting hacked.
Oh, port scan?
No, this is major. They've already burned through the NCIS public firewall.
Well, isolate the node and dump them on the other side of the router.
I'm trying. It's moving too fast.
Oh, this is not good. We're using our connection to the APHIS database.
So aside from all of the inaccuracies and all the weirdness there, in terms of, what a hacking attempt looks like and how you might prevent it, you can see here from a screen capture from that video that we have two people working on one keyboard. Not necessarily the most effective way. I don't know really how this particular portrayal ended up in a TV show where presumably all of the people that wrote the show, that participate in the show, they're in the show, use a keyboard on a regular basis and probably have never actually had this, this frenzied state where, two people at one keyboard ended up being a productive thing. So instead of this nonsense that we see here, what does adding additional people to a team look like, right? It usually looks more like this, where people are talking and collaborating and discussing things. Sometimes it's at a whiteboard and having those conversations. And even in the social network, you see, in the background, obviously, not in the foreground, but you see that there are a whole lot of people that are working together as Facebook grew into a bigger company. So the message here, though, is that building a product, software development, it really takes a village. Really, it takes high quality collaboration. Now, many of you probably know this. Many are probably like, yes, we need high quality collaboration. The thing is, though, what do we do with that information? So today, we'll be talking about collaboration principles from mob programming. And the question is, why should you even listen to me? Back in about 2012, I was pair programming a lot. We were doing I was working at Pluralsight at the time. We were doing what we called promiscuous pair programming, persistent promiscuous pair programming, where we switched pairs on a regular basis, usually at least once a day. And at that time, I discovered the practice of mob programming and actually introduced it And so we ended up mob programming there for a while. During this time, I got a chance to visit Hunter Industries, which is where the term mob programming was actually coined and popularized. You can see that's me right there. And then I actually, for a few years, built and ran a company that we hired people with little to no professional experience, programming at least, and had them work in mobs, and they produced code for our customers. And today I work at a company called Immersion, and we do mob programming. We do what I call mob first development. That doesn't mean that we don't sometimes work in pairs and don't sometimes solo program, but we use mob programming as our primary form of software development. And as you can see here, there's actually a hybrid mob. This is actually from earlier this week. The company is actually based in Utah. And the people that are in the office in Utah, you can see here, they were all together in the office. And then we had 3 additional people in the mob that were in other locations. All 3 of those are in different locations within the Atlanta metro area. So we have this, so I have some of this experience, and that's great. The thing is still, why should you listen to me? And the honest answer is maybe you shouldn't. We just listened to Jay talk about imposter syndrome and all of those things. And I'm pretty confident in my knowledge about mob programming. I am not the creator of it, but I have done a lot to popularize it and to evangelize it and to help practice it in a variety of situations. But maybe why you shouldn't is because of this quote from Kent Beck, where he said, all methodologies are based on fear. And really, mob programming is no different. Mob programming is a methodology of sorts. Now, you might go, like, fear, that seems odd. And if you've ever seen Kent Beck, right, he is a very nice man. Aside from some potentially questionable facial hair choices that you can see in this photo, here's a newer photo of him. You know, he smiles. He's very kind and warm and open. But yet he still said this thing: all methodologies are based on fear. Right? And the thing is that the methodologies that we adopt are based on the fears that we individually feel. Oftentimes methodologies are applied in a way such that, like, we assume that everybody is the same and that everybody is in the same boat, in the same context. But oftentimes we feel like we're a little bit different. That being said, oftentimes there are some things that bring us together that are more the same than we often think. So many of you may not yet be familiar with mob programming, and I've used that term a bunch, but let's just go over a quick definition, quick explanation of what mob programming is. So as I mentioned, I got the chance to visit Hunter Industries, which is a company in San Diego where they kind of originated this idea and popularized this idea of mob programming. And this guy right here, his name is Woody Zuhl, and he's been kind of the primary proponent of it. He goes around and does workshops and things like that. And so how he helped to define mob programming is he started with what he defined as agile software development. He said, it's all the brilliant people working on the same thing at the same time in the same space, right? We talk about co-location, and obviously that has changed a little bit in terms of like physical co-location over the last 18 months. But it's this idea that we're focused, we're working on the same thing, and we bring everybody together. Now, how he has taken this is said, okay, this is my definition of agile. Let's just add this one additional component and say we're going to do it at the same computer. So if we take this, right, and we use this, like when people hear mob programming, oftentimes what is evoked is this idea of a mob. And on my visit to Hunter Industries, Woody actually gifted me a T-shirt which has this image on it, and this is actually an illustration by Woody's wife, Andrea, who's actually a children's book illustrator. The thing is that while this particular image is provocative and elicits a response, hopefully not overwhelmingly negative, the other way that the word mob can be used is it refers to a group of kangaroos. And while kangaroos can be somewhat aggressive, they're also pretty cute. Additionally, mob programming has often started to be portrayed more like play. Again, this is another image that Andrea drew, and you can see that, again, in this particular case, it's a bunch of people that are a bunch of children in this case that are collaborating, but in a playful way, as opposed to an aggressive way. Sometimes mob programming is now referred to as ensemble programming. There are other words that people are using, collaborative programming, all of these different things. But for today, I'm going to use the term mob programming, as that's the one that I've used for a while. But there are other ways that it can be referred to that also evoke that same feeling of a lot of people working together on the same thing on the same computer. Now, when I say on the same computer, right, I'm not referring to this nonsense where there's multiple people at a single keyboard, but you do have often a designated driver, and that's the person at the keyboard. And then depending upon how you're particularly implementing mob programming, you may have a designated navigator, and you'll often have a designated navigator. And then you have other people who are engaged who are also sometimes just referred to as mobbers or the non-designated navigator. And how this works is on a cadence. The driver will move back and become a mobber, and the navigator or a different mobber will be promoted or moved into the role of the driver. So these things here, these labels are not labels for individual people, but they are labels for roles that are needed as part of mob programming. And the thing is, like, what do those mobbers do? Now, that's possibly a whole other presentation, and so I'm not necessarily going to get into that, but I will reference that Willem Larson put together some information around different behaviors that he saw non-navigator and driver people within a mob exhibit, and there's plenty of things for those people to do. So in addition to mob programming, this mob mentality, this idea of highly collaborative, working together mentality has been applied to other areas as well, to testing, to design, and you can find other references to those types of activities as well. And so today, given that not everybody here is going to be a programmer, and not everybody is necessarily even going to be working in software, although many, if not most of you are. The thing is that there's a lot of principles, right, that we can derive here, right? Because this idea of quality collaboration can be very challenging. Sometimes when we say collaboration, some people mean coordination, and what I'm not talking about coordination. I'm not talking about status meetings. I'm not talking about like meetings to coordinate work. I'm talking about this idea of like actually working together on a specific thing. Now, the thing is, why bother, right? Like, if this is really hard, if quality collaboration is hard, why even bother? So going back to what Kent Beck said, the next sentence of the quote, and this comes from his book, Extreme Programming, on extreme programming. And he says that you try to set up habits to prevent your fears from becoming reality. So specifically, it's not fear-driven development, which is sometimes which is referenced. If you look on the internet, you can find fear-driven development, and that can refer to things where development that is driven by fear of being fired, or development that is paralyzed by fear. That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about fears, like that we put habits in place in order to avoid things that we fear. And it kind of goes to this idea that, there are things that we value, and there's principles, and then there's the actual practices, right? The practices are those habits that we put into place. And by doing that, by looking at some of these practices in mob programming, we can therefore then see what principles perhaps can be derived that will help whether or not you're in a programming situation or not, a software development situation. Again, it's this idea that, we have all of these practices and specific practices, but we can derive principles from them. And again, mob programming may not be the thing for you based off, again, I'm going to present some fears here. Like perhaps you don't have the same fears that I do. Perhaps you're not in the same context that I am. And if that's the case, then hopefully some of the principles that we talk about today, that I share with you today, you can find practices that help you to achieve those in your particular context. Okay, so I'm going to go through and share some of the things that I personally fear. And these are things that are pretty scary, so I hope you're ready. They're things that I fear, and therefore part of why I value mob programming as a practice. So the first one, be ready, is unproductive meetings. Now, perhaps you're really great at meetings. Perhaps you've never been in an unproductive meeting. If that's the case, we should go out to lunch sometime, and I'd love to talk to you and find out what your secret is. But, most people think of meetings as something to be avoided. The thing is that I specifically, I've taken the stance that I am not anti-meeting. There are some people that complain about having too many meetings. I very much try to intentionally avoid complaining about having too many meetings. Now, that being said, I will complain about attempts to help unproductive meetings, because unproductive meetings are something that I do fear. Too many meetings, like that will take care of itself if we can right size and make the meetings more productive. Now, this next slide refers to pair programming, but the same type of thing can apply to mob programming. Oftentimes, there are a lot of meetings that we put in place in order to do that coordination that I talked about, that we want to reduce, in favor of collaboration. And so we end up in these meetings that we don't really like, that aren't engaging, that aren't actually helping. Now, if you look at this meeting, right, obviously this is like, I can't remember where I found this, but it's stock photography type stuff and is obviously dramatized. But if we look at a picture of this is a mob. This is Hunter Industries. They actually expanded and ended up with between 6 and 8 mobs at a certain point. And this is one of their mobs. You can see here that, we have somebody standing, multiple people standing. This person's leaned forward, engaged. Well, this person's kind of leaning back. They don't look like they're leaning back in a way that is body language like, I'm like, don't want to be here. And so you can see that in the case of mob programming, we don't necessarily see that same disengaged behavior, that unproductive thing. Now you're thinking, well, mob programming, that's not a meeting. Well, that looks a lot like a meeting. And so one of the things that I found is this model, this taxonomy, I guess, of 6 reasons that we have meetings. This is put forth by maybe Camphor Stewart. And she says, there's these 6 reasons that we might meet to connect, to align, decide, ideate, brainstorm, plan, and produce. And for me, mob programming is primarily a meeting in order to produce, right? We're producing code, we're producing a product, we're deploying a product, we're testing a product, all of those things, like we're producing. Now, these other reasons that we meet are actually often sprinkled throughout a mobbing session, right? There's a little bit of planning, right? There's a little bit of design work that happens. There's ideation on different ways that we can approach a particular problem. Decisions are made about what's going into the code. And obviously, as part of this, we have to align. Honestly, a lot of times in a mobbing session, you may not always be 100% focused on what it is. You do take breaks on occasion, and those breaks are often good opportunities to connect with the other people in your mob. Now, another thing with Zoom meeting, or with unproductive meetings, is this idea of Zoom fatigue. Now, one of the members of our mob, this guy right here, he admitted to me. So this mob actually formed as a hybrid mob, partly remote, before the pandemic. As I mentioned, we have some people that are in Utah, but these 3 individuals, well, specifically Eric and Matthew, both joined the team remotely from the Atlanta area previous to the pandemic. And so we were already figuring out this hybrid, this remote mobbing thing before we were forced to, which was really cool. But as the pandemic wore on, right, you heard a lot about Zoom fatigue. And this guy here, he actually at some point goes like, I don't understand what people are talking about with Zoom fatigue. Until he went to his first virtual conference. Now, virtual conferences have gotten a lot better. And I'll give you a little hint on how to avoid it, hopefully, over the next couple of days. But he came to me in a one-on-one, and he's like, I didn't know that people were talking about with Zoom fatigue until I went to this conference, to just sat there and watched presentations all day, right? And so one of the things that helps, right, is this idea of engaging. So you all have the chat, you have Q&A, you have other ways to engage with the conference today. I encourage you to use those. One of the things that we use in our online meetings is we use Miro a lot. That helps us to, again, stay engaged, be collaborative as we're meeting, so that it is not just a bunch of talking heads. Okay, so unproductive meetings. Hopefully you can avoid those, whether it's through mob programming or some other mechanism. Another fear I have is artificial harmony. Now you look at this picture and you're like, these 2 people, they look super happy, they're high-fiving, and maybe it's genuine, but a lot of times, maybe it's not super great. Right. Artificial harmony is often this tension, right, between diversity and conformity, right? We talk a lot about being aligned in terms of culture, having similar values, but we're different, right? In this particular image here, all of these different lanterns are, many of them are different shapes, different colors, but they're all lanterns and they're all lighting. So there's this tension between conformity and diversity. And the way that we can drive through that is to have productive ideological conflict. One of the ways that mob programming helps with this is that because everybody is together, there's one person at the keyboard, it helps to reduce the unproductive conflict. What's unproductive conflict, you might say? Well, I fortunately have not experienced this, but I have heard of like passive aggressive tabs versus spaces wars that are waged via pull requests or via comments or via commits and commit messages. we can drive a lot of that stuff out by, again, kind of using the mob programming paradigm as a forcing function to ensure that all of the work is going on in a productive way. But then we do have productive conflict, right? Because we do have to have all of those discussions. We're not going to let something go into the code that right there watching it that we might approve in like a code review because it's already done. But if we're collaboratively putting it together, we're more likely to have these productive conflicts. Okay. Next fear, interruption. So I recently had a product manager in our group indicate that he was a little bit hesitant to interrupt the group. In fact, like a year or two ago, while we here at Immersion, we had one of our QA engineers like not want to interrupt the mob, and we've since eliminated that as a barrier. But it was right after I started, and he was doing manual QA, and he'd find something and he'd kind of wait and this, and we had we ended up having a retrospective where we're like, you know what, like your goal for this next week is to interrupt the mob at least once a day. Now you're thinking, there is a lot of stuff out there. There are a lot of people that are like, why you shouldn't interrupt a programmer. There's a very famous comic that's referenced in this is part of that article. But there's things about the cost of interruption of software developer. Like, I mean, to the point where it is featured in Dilbert, right? This idea of interrupting programmers, right? We develop this mental model in our head, and we're able to, we get to a spot where we understand what's going on, and we're able to better, get kind of into this zone as we talk about. The thing is that another type of interruption that is very damaging is this idea of the lottery factor, which maybe you've heard of, right? We might be interrupted through disruptions to the composition of the team. The lottery factor refers to how many people on your team would have to win the lottery before some information would be irrevocably lost as part of your team, right? We want to avoid this idea of knowledge siloing, right? And mob programming really helps with this. And it helps with it in a way that is referred to as distributed cognition. I'm not super duper familiar with this particular idea, this concept, but it was actually brought up to me recently, and it fit very well with how I think about mob programming. Right? If you look at this image, right, from Andrea about, hey, look, none of these particular children in this have like are sole owners of the whole vision, right? They don't all know everything that's happening at all times in all parts of this. Another example of distributed cognition, you look in this meeting, we can distribute cognition among people. Everybody has their viewpoint, but also we can distribute cognition into technology. You notice that the sticky notes are a way to have something be cognitively stored. People have things stored into their computer. This kind of goes to this idea sometimes about read by refactoring. Like as I'm going through, this is a concept by Arlo Belshi talks about, where you're taking the information that you're gathering as you're understanding the code and putting it into the code by renaming things and adding methods and things like that. Again, this idea of like we're in this dynamic, complex, socio-technical system, and so maybe the cognition, isn't super concentrated in that one person. If we're not solo programming, then perhaps we can take advantage of this idea of distributed cognition. So I found this alternative comic that was kind of put forth as in contrast to the comic of the solo developer. And it goes to this idea that Again, this is an example from pairing. If we're able to be more resilient to interruptions, such as something as trivial as this, or in as significant as somebody leaving your team, that we're able to keep that flow of information, that flow of work proceeding, even if there is an interruption. One of the ways that we can achieve this with either pair programming or mob programming is this idea of strong style pairing. What this does is it contrasts sometimes what we do as pair programmers is like, well, I have an idea, give me the keyboard. It's like, well, instead of that, we go with this idea that the person who actually has the idea should not be the person with the keyboard. It goes to this thing that Llewellyn Falco said, that for an idea to go from your head into the computer, it must go through someone else's hands. This requires is that the person with the idea has to say it out loud. I don't know about you, but I've had plenty of things that sounded great in my head. And when I send it out loud, I realized that was probably not the greatest idea. And so by forcing the idea to go through two people's heads, essentially go out of one person and into somebody else's ear, it helps to clarify. It helps to build better software and build better products. The other thing this does is, again, in terms of that resilience to interruption, is that it helps us to stay at this level of intent, that we are sharing the intent. We're making sure that everybody understands what the intent is of the code or product that we're trying to drive forward. And that helps us to, again, have that better idea of distributed cognition. Okay, another fear is stagnant skills. So many of you have probably seen this little interchange, this fictional interchange. I don't know, perhaps it was a real interchange at some point. Oftentimes it's portrayed as the interchange between a CFO who says this, and then a CEO that responds with, what happens if we don't, and they stay. Ongoing development and education of, opportunities for growth in any employees within a company is super important, because it allows us to continue to get better and to be more productive, and as well as just be able to contribute more and feel better about what we're doing. So the thing is that with mob programming, we tend to learn as you go, as opposed to having formal learning sessions. Now, that being said, in immersion, we do have weekly dojos where we do more formal structured learning activities. But a lot of the learning that happens is actually in the mob, right? It might be something as trivial as, hey, I learned this keyboard shortcut, or I know this keyboard shortcut and I'm going to do it. And people are going to go, what is that keyboard shortcut? And that keyboard shortcut is now going to be distributed as knowledge among the whole team, to be something as significant as understanding the architectural patterns that are at play in a particular interaction between different parts of the system. So the side effect of this is that with onboarding, we don't do a lot of formal onboarding. As we have had new developers join our team, I've spent probably an hour or two with them, making sure that the HR stuff is settled, making sure they have the tools and access to the things that they need, like just in terms of like authorization and authentication, they have credentials to everything. And then I will hand them off to the particular team they'll be working on, and the mob will help them get set up to the level that they need to at any given point. They might stop and do a little bit of explanation at a high level, but again, a lot of that comes throughout the process as it's needed, kind of in a pull model. So, okay. Another fear is hidden work in queues, right? There's this idea that sometimes we're, in a physical situation, it's very easy to see that we're all aligned, that we're all going in the same direction. In a musical group, like an orchestra, you can hear when somebody is misaligned in some way. The thing is that with knowledge work, it's very hard to know if we're actually aligned, right? We all maybe think that we all agree, but the reality might be different. What this kind of sometimes can lead to is this idea of rogue features. Previous to me joining Immersion, we had a mid-level developer that decided, I think kind of on his own initiative, that he was going to build a feature. He really wanted to build it. He'd heard that it was maybe something important, and not that it wasn't something that possibly could have been built in a way that was useful. But he kind of went off on his own for a week and came back and said, here's this thing that I built. And unfortunately then took two of the senior developers on the team a week or two to get it to actually work. And you're probably wondering, why is there a picture of a camel on this particular slide? My thinking is that, it's like that old story of the camel that puts his nose into the tent and then keeps going, puts his head into the tent. And there's this idea of the sunk cost fallacy. It's like, well, you did it, so now we have to get it to work. And now, this camel of this rogue feature is now taken over. And honestly, we're still paying the cost of having this feature that actually, doesn't work super well, puts a load on our system that doesn't need to be there most of the time. And, we haven't had the opportunity to take it out because it is adding some value. It's just, but it's at this point, the camel's in the tent. So with mob programming, a lot of times we want to prioritize things because we're working in a way such that we're all working together, and we know what needs to be done, and we are very much making visible the things that we're doing. Okay, merging. This is more technical, right? Merging two train tracks, that looks like it's pretty easy. The thing is that merging often looks more like this. This is an actual photo from an exit here in Atlanta, where apparently 3 people thought about getting off the freeway and merging into that one exit lane at the same time. We can see how well that worked out. And, that's what merging branches often looks like more. Mob programming allows us to get to closer, at least, to trunk-based development. And a lot of times, that allows us to not go off and do our own things and then try to merge things together and figure out how it's all going to integrate. We can be doing this idea of continuous integration. In a non-coding context, right? Google Docs and Sheets allows us to do this. Previous to tools like Google Docs, a lot of times what you do is you'd have a Word doc, you'd type it up and you'd email it, and then you'd have multiple different versions of it flying around. Excuse me. But Google Docs allows us to actually collaborate together, actually some simultaneous editing and all of those things that are super valuable. Another fear is low quality work. How this is often addressed is by having a manager that's like the Eye of Sauron and just looking and making sure that everything is going well, or a technology lead, or somebody who reviews all of the pull requests, or is making sure to be in all the code reviews. We can address this with mob programming often by doing this idea of working out loud, right? We're making sure that we're being very conscious of what it is that we're doing. We're doing that intent, location, detail. We're doing the idea of strong style pairing. We're being very visible about what it is that we do. The other thing is that we can, instead of waiting for a code review or a PR to be reviewed or something like that, we can get feedback quickly. We shorten the length of our feedback loops by the fact that, I say an idea and we can immediately discuss it, or I type this thing and I can get immediate feedback on what it is that I'm typing, if that's an appropriate thing to do. The thing is that oftentimes we think, well, if we just all individually did our thing, things would go much faster and possibly better. But Mob programming really helps us to think about things in terms of we want not just to have the highs and lows of everybody, but if we're working together, we can consistently be getting the best out of everybody. Okay, last fear. I know I'm running low on time, which is appropriate given that the last fear is not finishing. Right? We want to make sure that we're in a situation where we're actually getting things of value finished, deployed to customers so that they can be using it, right? One of the things that's, in retail, right? Like, you think about all of the hours that went to getting these things onto the shelf, but yet they're still not in a position where they're actually being enjoyed by a customer and actually in a position of value. So there's this idea of inventory, right? In a worst case scenario, right? It's not even stuck at the retail shelf, it's stuck in a warehouse somewhere. And so if we can't get things actually finished, actually deployed, actually in the hands of customer, actually getting feedback on them, they can be very frustrating as somebody who builds software. And so the technique we can use here, and this is kind of a natural consequence, and it's something you can do regardless. And I actually think I looked at the schedule and there's a couple of people talking about this later in the conference. So I'm hoping to attend those. It's this idea of limiting work in process, having WIP limits. Now, I'm not going to be able to dig deep into this whole idea of WIP limits because we often think of work in process as like effort in process, but really it's like putting different work in flight and then actually trying to get it done, actually trying to get it delivered. Again, not finishing, actually getting things finished. It's portrayed sometimes as, stay focused, limit WIP. And really the thing that, this is the phrase that really gets me focused and is helps me to remember is, oftentimes we get a lot of value. We feel a lot of positive emotions, I guess, around starting things like, oh, look at all these things that we have going on. But there's a lot more to be said about actually having things finished. So again, all methodologies are based on fear. And so mob programming is a practice. Again, it's a methodology that helps me and in the situations that I've been over the last almost 10 years to have the habits that help those fears from becoming reality. You may not have the same fears that I do, but I imagine, again, that you have at least some of these. And mob programming, well, that might not be a good fit for where you're at. Perhaps pair programming would work and would alleviate some of these fears. And there might be other practices that might either apply in a programming situation or in a non-programming situation, like we talked about mob testing and mob design, all of those things. So again, if you feel any of these fears, mob programming or mobbing in some way might be a useful thing to look at. Again, at Immersion, we found this to be super useful. So useful, in fact, that we started what we call a guest mobber program. And so if you are interested, you can follow this link and I'll put it in the chat in Whova afterwards so you can have this as an actual link. But if you'd like to, you can follow this link and you can come and join us for a couple hours and actually not just mob in a toy situation, but mob in a real situation where we're actually working on whatever product code that we need to work on that particular day. So thank you, everybody. Hopefully you've been able to find some principles that you can pull out of this and that will be useful to you. I'd love to keep in touch with any of you that would like to. And thank you.